In the 8th century BCE, a new king took the throne in Judah, and he would help reshape the future of Jewish history. This is History Makers, a series where I'll be introducing you to the people responsible for shaping and sometimes reshaping Jewish history in incredible ways. Our first history maker is King Hezekiah of Judah, Chizkiyahu HaMelech. We know Hezekiah was born sometime around the middle of the 8th century BCE, likely during the reign of his father Ahaz. He belonged to the house of David, the royal dynasty that traced itself back to King David, roughly 13 generations earlier. By the time Hezekiah came to the throne around 715 BCE, the world around Judah had become extraordinarily dangerous. The great power of the age was the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a militarized superpower expanding westward from Mesopotamia. Assyria did not merely defeat kingdoms, it absorbed them, deported populations, extracted tribute, and reshaped entire regions. And Judah had already watched this happen up close. In 722 BCE, only a few years before Hezekiah's reign began, the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians after the capture of Samaria. That collapse changed the balance of Israelite history. Judah now became the primary surviving Israelite kingdom. It still possessed a Davidic monarchy, it still maintained the temple in Jerusalem, and now it carried the political and religious weight that had once been shared across multiple Israelite states. The effects were visible on the ground. Archaeology suggested that Jerusalem expanded significantly during this period. Refugees likely moved south from the destroyed northern territories. New neighborhoods emerged on the western hill of the city. Massive fortifications appeared, including the structure now known as the Broad Wall, parts of which can still be seen in Jerusalem's Old City today. This was no longer a modest highlands capital. Judah was becoming a state under pressure, and pressure forces adaptation. Hezekiah ruled inside that reality. The biblical texts portray him as a religious reformer, but his reign was also deeply administrative, strategic, and infrastructural. He governed like a king who understood that Assyria was not a distant possibility, it was an approaching certainty. One of the most important aspects of his reign involved religion itself, though. Many people imagine that once Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem, Israelite worship naturally revolved around it alone. But the historical picture seems much more complicated. Religious life throughout Judah remained highly localized. Across towns and rural villages, people worshipped at sites known in Hebrew as bamot, usually translated as high places. These were local cultic centers, often elevated locations containing altars, standing stones, incense installations, and sacrificial areas serving nearby populations. Archaeological remains from sites across the region reveal just how widespread this religious landscape had been. The Jerusalem temple existed within a broader network of worship rather than functioning as an uncontested monopoly, it seems. Hezekiah attempted to change that, though. According to the second book of Kings, he removed the bamot, destroyed sacred pillars and cultic poles, and broke apart the bronze serpents, the nehushtan, an object that's associated with biblical memory of Moses himself. The text stated that people had begun burning incense to the nehushtan. That detail mattered a lot because it showed that older sacred objects, local traditions, and decentralized practices still carried religious authority among the population centuries after the Exodus traditions had taken shape. Hezekiah's reforms therefore represented more than piety. They represented centralization. Power, sacrifice, priesthood, legitimacy, and national identity increasingly converged around Jerusalem. And this mattered politically just as much as it mattered spiritually. Local shrines meant local authority. Local authority meant fragmented influence. A kingdom facing imperial pressure benefited from tighter systems, clearer administration, and stronger central control. Religion and governance were deeply intertwined at the time. At the same time, Hezekiah invested heavily in preparing Jerusalem for siege warfare. Nothing mattered more in an ancient siege than water. Jerusalem's primary water source, the Gihon Spring, lay outside the city's older defensive perimeter, leaving it dangerously exposed if enemy forces surrounded the capital. Hezekiah's solutions became one of the most famous engineering achievements of the biblical world. Workers carved a tunnel through roughly 533 meters of solid limestone bedrock, redirecting water from the Gihon Spring into the city itself toward the pool of Siloam. The tunnel still exists today. People can still walk through it today, beneath Jerusalem. And inside it, archaeologists discovered the Siloam inscription, written in ancient Hebrew script, commemorating the point when the two excavation teams tunneling from opposite directions finally met underground. That's how it was built. It is one of the most extraordinary surviving artifacts from the Kingdom of Judah. Later, in 701 BCE, the crisis arrived. Across the Levant, several kingdoms rebelled against Assyrian domination, and Hezekiah joined the anti-Assyrian coalition, likely encouraged by regional instability and Egyptian diplomacy. But the gamble failed. The Assyrian king Sennacherib launched a devastating military campaign into Judah. Dozens of fortified cities fell. The countryside was ravaged. One of the most important casualties was the city of Lachish, which was Judah's second most important city after Jerusalem at the time. The siege of Lachish became so significant that the Assyrians immortalized it in monumental relief carvings displayed in Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh. And those reliefs still exist today in the British Museum, depicting battering rams, impaled captives, deportations, and the destruction of the city in extraordinary detail. And then the Assyrian army advanced on Jerusalem. The Assyrian records later described Hezekiah trapped in the city like a caged bird. That phrase became one of the most famous descriptions in the history of the ancient Near East. Importantly, however, the inscription celebrated tribute and containment, not the actual capture of Jerusalem itself. The city appears to have survived. The reasons remain debated by historians. Biblical texts framed the survival in theological terms. Assyrian records framed the campaign as successful intimidation and submission. Historians continue to argue over precisely what happened. But the broader reality is clear. Judah was devastated, yet Jerusalem endured. Hezekiah stayed on the throne, though under heavy Assyrian domination, and after paying enormous tribute. This became one of the defining survival patterns of First Temple Judah, though. Not triumph, but endurance under conditions imposed by empire. Hezekiah died around 686 BCE and was buried in Jerusalem. His son Manasseh succeeded him and appears, according to the biblical tradition, to have reversed many of his father's centralizing reforms by restoring local cultic practices and broader forms of worship. But Hezekiah's long-term impact remained profound. His reign accelerated the transformation of Jerusalem into the political, administrative, and increasingly religious center of Judah. That process continued under later kings, especially Josiah, Yoshiahu, whose reforms pushed even further toward text-based religious authority and centralized worship. The deeper point is this. The Judaism that eventually survived exile and dispersion did not emerge fully from a single moment in biblical history. It seems to have developed gradually through crisis, reform, administration, infrastructure, political centralization, and imperial pressure. And Hezekiah stood near the very center of that transformation, not simply as a righteous king remembered in scripture, but as one of the architects of the world that later became Judaism.